maybe we can begin with when your interest in altered states of consciousness first began.
It began very early, in fact, strangely, because I suppose because of my background, where I live, which is in a very, very isolated place. I'm still there, on the edge of a fen, surrounded by 3 moats. So it's a very isolated, beautiful place. And so it was a lonely childhood. And I remember having quite a strong relationship with mystical experiences from an early age. There was a kind of God figure who I was very close to, who lived on a mound at the edge of a moat. And so I was, and also my mother was Catholic, so I grew up a Catholic with a kind of strong spiritual bent. But my father was atheist, so it kind of balanced. And my godfather was became a rather famous Buddhist monk because he translated their main books from Pali into English. And so I always had a passion for it from the age of whatever, 10, 8, that sort of thing onwards, and read books on Hinduism, Buddhism, that sort of thing. And then when I was, 16, I won the school science prize and said I wanted books on Buddhism and Hinduism. And the nun said no. So then I said, thanks very much, I'm off. And so I left school and went with £25, because that was all one was allowed, and anyway, all I had, to get to Sri Lanka by land and see my godfather, where he was living on an island. Candy. Anyway, I never got there. But that was the kind of beginning of my interest in mysticism. And then I followed it on. And later I started studying under kind of the person who at that point was the leading expert in the world, someone called Professor Zayner at All Souls in Oxford. And he became my tutor on mystical experience and comparative religions for a couple of years. I didn't actually agree with what he said, because he had a rather, he was a Catholic convert and didn't really enjoy psychedelics at all. So he had a rather tainted attitude. And then when I first experienced LSD in 1965, I realized, wow, this is what I've been studying. This is the experience again, because I recognized it from childhood. And I was amazed and wondered by it. But at the same time, without the knowledge of how psychedelics work, I thought, well, it's an utterly wonderful experience to enter into and explore and learn from, but it's not really a way of life. And that was in 1965. And then I had a trauma when someone put thousands of LSD trips into my coffee without telling me. And I retired to a hut down here at Beckley. And then a while later, someone came and asked me to go to a party in London, which I went to. And there I met a Dutch scientist called Bart Huges, who had been trained as a doctor and was the only person I'd ever say I've met who I consider a genius. And he had a whole hypothesis about the mechanisms underlying the changes brought about by psychedelics and cannabis and other things, standing on the head, yoga, deep breathing, a whole theory about changing capillary volume in the brain and how you can control your increased consciousness, which comes about through the use of a psychedelic. And that really changed my life. And I realized that that was the mission I'd been looking for, because I'd always thought I had a mission of kind of watering the desert, is how I verbalized it. But actually, I saw it was watering the human brain, irrigating it to its full level. And so I was really excited about this new knowledge. And we actually had the habit of, at that point, that was in 66 when it was still legal, and Bart had in fact made the LSD. He wasn't a chemist, but he and his mathematical friend had made LSD in the friend's mother's kitchen, and she threw away, not knowing it was what it was, so they had to make it again. And that was the LSD which actually turned Europe on. And funny enough, the first LSD I had was actually from his batch. But we took it in a completely different way, in the sense that we took it to work. And our work was studying human nature, human consciousness, what are the underlying mechanisms, and particularly interested in the mechanism of the ego, which we saw as a conditioned reflex mechanism, conditioned by by conditioning word, which is responsible for distributing the blood in the brain where it is most needed. So it's like a government inside the psyche, which controls what enters consciousness and what doesn't. And the recognition of the word is the trigger to direct the blood where you want it, in many cases, that part. So it was a whole new way of looking at the self. And obviously it's much too, I can't go into it now, but it made a very big change to my understanding of myself and how we became as a species from an upright talking ape, how we became the dominant animal in the world, and why we're both so clever and yet so really basically insane, I mean, neurotic to psychotic, and what are the underlying mechanisms which caused us to develop in the way we did. So that really became my passion. I'd been brought up really in more an artistic background. My father was a painter. And so that became my first deep plunge into science. And I really stuck there ever since. In that period, those years, I read the whole of Freud and Reich and Nietzsche and a whole lot of other things on LSD, which most people don't read complicated text on LSD, but by keeping one's sugar level normal, and by that I mean taking vitamin C so that the body can make adrenaline, which keeps the sugar level from going too low, and also being conscious of keeping your sugar level normal, so having sweetmeats to eat all the time to keep it at near the normal rate. And I was very familiar with glucose level because my father came back from the war a bad diabetic, which it wasn't discovered for a year or two, and then it was discovered. And I, as the youngest in the family, was his kind of beloved dog, his little companion who went everywhere with him, fed him glucose when he'd start passing out, which he did many times a day because he didn't want to go blind by eating too much sugar. So I knew the sugar level concept from early childhood. And so when I realized that the underlying mechanism is an increase in combustion of glucose in the brain, it all made great sense to me. And I found I can control the LSD I took in order to concentrate and do the function, the work, or whatever we were doing at a top level, at a level higher than I'd normally do. And I suppose the interesting thing, I tested, and is it all fantasy that one was doing it better? There's a strong possibility. So I had a very good test on it, actually, because for our relaxation, we played the old Chinese game of Go. I don't know if you know it, but it's pure cognition. It's there's no chance. And when you play regularly, you know your opponent's game. And we played very quickly and very regularly. And I was a slightly better player than my usual opponent, so he had a handicap of 3. But when I was on LSD and he wasn't, and when I say on LSD, I mean on LSD with glucose at hand, and one uses a lot of glucose to keep on top of go board, I won more games, considerably more. I mean, his handicap went up to 6, which is winning 9 games. So that's, a considerable improvement. So for my own satisfaction, that was a marker of improved cognition. And in a funny sort of way, that was largely while we were researching the LSD. And so actually that period, when it was legal, then became my founding stones of my passion to decide I'm going to research this and hopefully find out better about the mechanisms. And my aim was to integrate it into the fabric of society so that it's just an accepted fact that we can change consciousness, like in places like India. They know that is an accepted fact. And that I never thought everyone would use it, but I thought it was an invaluable tool for humanity to have in their back pocket, to treat illness, but also to induce the mystical experience, to transform oneself, to explore one's hang-ups and neuroses, dig them. And what we did was do therapy on ourselves. I've never been to a therapist, actually, but over those 3 years, I would say it was a period of self-psychoanalysis. So, when one read, studied, all of that, one would keep the sugar level normal. But when one wanted to dig into oneself, one would not eat sugar and go into a state of sugar lack and ego loss. And so even back then, which was 1966-7 onwards, I was very conscious of the ego, which we now call the default mode network, but how the psychedelic state puts it to rest. And so the rest of the brain, the unconscious, can come up into the foreground, and one can dig around and wash out traumas. And for instance, I used to, since I was 13, I smoked tobacco, nicotine, because I was very tall and I had heard it stops you growing. So, I'd by 23 become quite a nicotine addict. And Bart, who was both my mentor and also my lover, said it was a horrible habit. And so I decided I'll give it up. And so one day I took LSD with the intention of never smoking again. And I never smoked again. And actually that led me 50 years later, or however many years later it was, when I was talking to Roland Griffiths about us collaborating on a study. I had £5,000 or dollars, I think, at that point, to invest in a study. And we were discussing what we might do. And so I suggested overcoming nicotine, because I'd already done it in childhood, in the past. And so that was the initiation of our nicotine study at Johns Hopkins, which has got the first study, I think, an 80% success rate or something, very, very high, way beyond what you can get in normal therapy. So that really was my baptism of fire, you could say, but it was a most wonderful period. But our period was very different to the hippie world, which was going out the Rolling Stones would be playing in Hyde Park, which was kind of half a mile from where we lived. And we wouldn't bother to go because we were so enchanted with our own work and our own discoveries. That was filling our passion. And so in a way that passion's gone on, and that's where the roots of my work started.